Earlier this year, I was lucky to attend a conference held in Williamsburg, Virginia. On the panel at this conference were 4 C-level leaders from various different states, all who had deployed Office 365. One of the questions that was asked of them is, if you had to do it all over again, what would you have done differently? And across the board, each one of them answered basically the same thing in their own way. They might not have known the right words to say, but they knew what they were all talking about. They hadn't rolled out the services with a governance plan that would allow them to safely and securely roll out all the features that they wanted to. They weren't quite sure exactly how they were going to operate that environment, and maybe most importantly, they didn't really understand that Office 365 in many respects is a bundled suite of services, a framework, if you will, that will allow them to build their services based on service descriptions that they should be developing. They hadn't quite figured that out yet. And to a man and a woman, they all came across and said, if I had to do it differently, I would have planned it better. I would have thought about all of those things differently, and when I would put those things in place, before I moved mailboxes to the cloud, or before I thought about taking a hybrid SharePoint approach, or how I thought about my instant messaging and my presence. And maybe the most important one, how I thought about external sharing and working with business partners and other agencies in their organization. This session today, Getting Started the Right Way, Planning and Governance, is going to discuss how organizations can benefit from that type of upfront planning, how it's imperative for them to understand the security, compliance, service descriptions, and governance that are going to help them be successful, not just in their initial implementation, but as this service evolves and changes over time. Our presenter today is Bob Ballard. Bob is the Principal Cloud Strategist and Architect at Planet Technologies. Bob was also a 14-year member of the Microsoft staff and formerly was the lead technologist for state and local government for Microsoft. We also have with us on a panel today Tony Lanzafame. Tony is a collaboration specialist at Microsoft today. He's been at Microsoft for 5 years. Before that, he helped roll out SharePoint for a US-wide utilities and conglomerate. Travis Moore. Travis is our cloud architect for our Planet Technologies West Coast division. Travis has been instrumental in helping us roll out Office 365 in the right way to large customers and agencies across the state of California. And then finally, Dave Riley. Dave is our client director for our Northeast here at Planet Technologies, but before that, he was a CIO for an agency within Massachusetts, as well as worked many years in Microsoft as a chief salesperson and chief director for the Northeast region. With that, I'm going to turn this session over to Bob Ballard. Bob, I'm excited to see your presentation.
Thanks, Steve, and I'm excited to kick off the summit today with a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. So the Cloud Enterprise Services Framework is really about making sure to do all those things that you mentioned, right? Which was, get the story right rolling out the door. So start off with a quote. I like to start off with a quote. And it's funny, in my days, 14 years at Microsoft, this goes against everything I used to say, which is I sold how beautiful and elegant and sexy the Office 365 solution was. And that's the reason to go down the path, for sure, right? What it brings to your end users. But then once you get it in, building that solid foundation actually makes those visions painted by the Microsoft team come true, right? And so it's not the beauty of the building you should look at, it's the construction of the foundation that will stand the test of time. So what the heck is this thing, the Cloud Enterprise Services Framework, right? And just like so many of these frameworks, it works in a circular motion, right? We start off by documenting or updating, if we're going through the second time, your current processes, right? We map your compliance goals, right? Establish security requirements, document those required service settings. So literally take those things, translate them to what those settings should be in the Office 365 framework itself, in the admin console, et cetera. Create service descriptions, which I think is super important, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Establish your governance policies. Okay, so now we've made all the settings. We've created service descriptions to say what the service is. What do I need to do if an organization, an agency, a department needs to make a change, right? Create those policies. Assign ownership to the major lines of service and areas within these documents. This is absolutely critical, by the way, because as much as I think at Planet we'd love to just stay around and write these documents with you for the next 30 years, you really need to take ownership of these your own team once you get started, right? And then, the service changes, or you add a new one, or it makes updates. And then we start the whole thing over again, right? And the idea by assigning this ownership, for instance, is that you can take over, controlling these things once we sort of lay the framework and foundation for you. So what are the, big pieces of the Enterprise Cloud Services framework? Custom documentation and guidance that you're looking for. So, it's operational guidance, including, clear runbook style things that say, hey, these are, here's what you need to set. It's security, compliance, and governance review, right? So we actually have a series of spreadsheets and other documents that we walk through with you and take a look at this. And then it's customized service descriptions. And then, all of this built together sort of delivers a package to you that sort of does all those things that those C-level execs that Steve referred to at the beginning, wish they had done better. So, operational guidance. We're talking about documented service operations guidance. By the way, Microsoft makes tons of stuff that's like this already. We're not talking about cutting and pasting those. We're talking about adjusting those guides to meet your needs, right? And that's a huge difference, right? And I think that's where people went wrong. They're like, oh, well, we don't need any of this stuff because there's a published service description. Except for most of our customers, you don't turn everything on, right? So this isn't these kinds of documents, right? Detailed onboarding, offboarding procedures, right? This is clearly a problem that many of our customers don't really think through. What do I need to do, when it comes to retention policies, et cetera? And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But what do I need to do to make sure that those things are adhered to all the way through the life cycle of a user? There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to these cloud services. And end user adoption plans, right? Time and time again we find, and I know there'll be additional sessions later that talk about this more, but time and time again we find that the number one impediment to what I would say is a successful implementation is not having, a quality end user adoption plan in place, right? So on the security, compliance, and governance side, right, sitting down with your core technologists, security folks, sometimes even legal and compliance folks as well, right, and understand what requirements do you have. Map those requirements to a service capability. And then document any gaps that there might be, right? So, obviously we can list what can be done. We can say, here's how you do it in Office 365. And then we need to identify, okay, do I need a third-party product? Do I need to think about adjusting what I was going to do? Because these, we need to identify these gaps. Understand your current governance policies, right? So, by the way, that doesn't mean what you do now is going to work in the new world, but it's good to know sort of what that framework is. Adjust and apply that to the current service with any changes we determine. By the way, I speak from the heart when I say almost every customer decides what we were doing is not good enough and stringent enough and effective enough, particularly my government customers, to carry forward. It's not well documented, so now's the time to make those changes. But starting from something that seems familiar is good, right? And then, document the go forward. For customers that have gone through this process with us, we have literally written, the governance document that says this is the process to request a change in the service, right? And you're going to struggle here at first if you don't set clear guidelines on this, right? There's certain things that can and can't be turned on because of the limitations, because of the configuration of the service is really the right word, right? And then But then on top of that, right, you make determinations as an organization based on all that exercise that we've gone through that what might or might not be turned on. And so, however, down-level state agencies or departments or business groups are reading the What's New in Office 365 blog and say, I want that, right? So they need to understand how I can get there. Another critical piece really is the customized service descriptions, right? So we want to determine and document the desired run state for you, right? So the idea is, okay, what do you think after we've gone through all of these discussions? And by the way, that's critical. Let's talk about the features and functions of the service, what they do, what those impacts are on security, compliance, and governance in sort of the earlier section. Coming out of that, we say, okay, what do we want to do with this? We pull and poke a little bit more, and we come up with, okay, this is what we think should be turned on and how it should be configured, right? Establish and document all the key policies. And this is not inclusive of everything, but things like, what are your retention policies going to be? How are you going to handle e-discovery? What's the data disposition, right? That's a big part that confuses customers right out of the gate. So I say, oh, I set my retention policy for 7 years. But that doesn't necessarily mean, for instance, that the data is gone after 7 years, right? So we need to think about all of those things. Develop tiered service descriptions, right? And this is something that I think we learned working with a customer that really can help make sense. And that's sort of write an escalating service description that gets gradually more technical to deliver to a series of audiences. Hey, if I read the first 10 pages, it's very much about what I can do with the product, right? Then I get a little deeper into, here are all the things that, sort of down-level IT can do and business group IT or, quasi-IT folks can do. And then get a little deeper into, here is your operational IT framework for all the settings and what we've chosen to do for them. This is turned off, this is turned on, this is how they work. We set this at 100 megs, we set this at a gig, whatever. So why is this important, right? So, we kind of went through and we're delivering all these discussions and documents and policies, et cetera. Why is this important? So to start off with, it's a lot like your children, right? So, you often say kids want to have no rules, but they actually thrive better when they have them. They're setting ground rules helps everybody understand normal, right? So if they don't know, if it's just like, hey, we're rolling out OneDrive, but there's not a clear, documented, concise guidance on what you can and can't do, then the assumption is anything that can be done with the service, I expect to be there, right? Hey, my wife works over at so-and-so, and she shares with her external attorneys all the time, right? Well, at the end of the day, we made a decision based on, talking through that it wasn't right for your compliance needs, whatever that might be, so it helps to establish normal. And then, the funny thing is, once you get good at going through this process on a couple of services, you get good at doing this, right? Not only, obviously, Planet has gotten quite good at this, but, we turn that knowledge over to you to say, this is everything you have to walk through to turn on a service. Because guess what? I don't know, last time you checked, Office 365 is unrecognizable from what it looked like a year and a half or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, right? And that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all, but how many new services? Every day I log on to Office 365, I feel like there's new tiles that pop up on my screen, right? So we need to do this for all of that stuff. And then, from a talk I did a while ago at a university, it helps build the child-proof playroom, right? And I love this analogy because the big point about a playroom is you want your child to still explore and do what they need to do and get what they need out of it, right? It's about making the room for them, but it's also about protecting them from injuring themselves, right? So we're not trying to say, we don't want to build a service that's all about you can't, right? It's about you can, but I have these, I've got electric socket stoppers in, and I got pads on the corners of tables, and I got some things just so we can't blow up the ranch, right? And so, I like that analogy. So it kind of helps build that, right? Like if we have the framework in place, we can let users do the things they want to do. Guard against the big red lever mentality, right? And that's important. So I did a blog post a little while ago about trying to avoid in Office 365 or other cloud services, pulling the big red lever down that turns services off universally under all circumstances. When there's a lot of ways, by the way, proven and documented, that say you can leave that lever on and protect those entities that have more stringent requirements by allowing those that don't to communicate, right? So if you understand this process, then the default answer isn't, we got to turn that off, right? Because at the end of the day, going back to the child room thing, our end users want these things, right? Microsoft did not create these features in a vacuum, right? These are what users were looking for. So as final thought, this can apply to any service. This is the Office 365 Summit, right? So obviously we focused on Office 365. But this really can be walked through with anything. It's important even if you've already deployed. And I think that going back to Steve's initial intro, right? If I had to do it all over again, the reality is we can sit down with you. These documents are still important even if your stuff is out in the wild, right? So we can sit down with you and say, here are the pieces of this framework you've already done on your own, and here's where your gaps are, right? And help you fill them out. So now you have the process and cycle down. All of this drives higher end user satisfaction across the board, right? Understanding what they can and can't do, having clear guidance on how to adopt those technologies, and having a process to request change based on their business needs, and feeling like that's all documented and it's not arbitrary, really does drive up higher end user satisfaction. So with that, that's the end of the presentation piece. I'll turn over to the panel.
So now let's get started with our panel discussion. And again, I want to introduce our panelists. This is Bob Ballard, again, with Planet Technologies, Tony Lanzafame with Microsoft, Travis Moore with Planet, and Dave Riley as well with Planet. Guys, we've got an unbelievable wealth of experience here, not just in cloud technologies and Office 365, but even on-premises technologies. And so I'm hoping that we can leverage some of those experiences today to help our audience. Tony, let me start with you. This all sounds great and it looks great, but it seems like it might be large. So we might have some, mid-sized enterprises and mid-sized government agencies here, a couple thousand seats, those types of things that might be looking at this and saying, yeah, it seems great, but seems a lot more than we would need. How are you seeing some of those mid-sized organizations adopt this type of solutioning?
Oh, absolutely. So from a governance perspective, start with the business requirements. So a lot of this information is already like institutional knowledge. It's documented somewhere, so it's a matter of just pulling it together, documenting the requirements, and then putting it into action.
So and are you seeing that they're struggling with sort of the service description notion, like they might be thinking, okay, Microsoft's going to provide us this service description as opposed to Microsoft providing us this silly putty, if you will?
Yeah, that's definitely a problem that we're seeing, is that fear of the unknown. So customers are accustomed to managing and developing solutions on premises. They're going to the cloud. It's evergreen, so things are constantly changing. So I think it's a matter of making sure that you take the requirements that are already in place with the organization, getting a governance board per se, and getting some participation from the business as well, making sure that you've got representation from your legal team, your compliance team, so that you're meeting the requirements of the industry.
And I think it's super important, but it's scalable, right? I mean, it's scalable, meaning that, in Travis's instance, where they're doing things in some of the larger Western states, right? Travis, I'm assuming that you're seeing them adopt it in a very broad way, whereas maybe some of the mid-sized customers are adopting the same concepts, but maybe in a much kind of more concise way. Would you?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Steve. So, and to take that a step further is really what I look at. A lot of organizations already have their standardizations in place. They just don't realize it. So we'll go in, we'll look at their processes. I mean, it goes all the way down to naming conventions, managing your identities, who's accessing what data and from where. And that's kind of where I focus. So, in my background being infrastructure, is who's accessing the data, where are they accessing it, and then from there you can create your policies to determine who's going to access it. So take OneDrive for Business or SharePoint site collections, those types of things. You can nest users in security groups and then put your naming conventions like within the documents that you upload, those types of things. And it can be a very simple onboarding process for governance as far as getting that initial seeding of the information, and then from there you can expand on it, and then overlay all of that with your any compliance, regulatory compliance, those types of things.
Now, Travis, in those accounts, in those customers, are they simply taking their current on-premises versions of those, if they even have them, and moving them to the cloud? How much work is being done to update them for these Office 365 services?
It varies from organization, but for the most part, we are able to lift and shift what they have in place. But of course, we perform a due diligence. We'll go in and we'll look at the information. If they don't have anything in place, then we'll put suggestions, or again, we'll go back to that security groups, or who's accessing what data. Do you have the naming conventions? Once that's in there, or we've identified that it is there, then we can move it up there, and then any policy that's in place in Office 365 will go ahead and take effect on the information.
So Dave, you have a really interesting perspective here, because you've been a state agency CIO, you've worked at Microsoft trying to help customers adopt this technology, and now you're at Planet. I'm fascinated to understand how you think our customers should be viewing this conversation, right? What is it that they should be hearing as CIOs for counties, cities, agencies, departments? What should they be hearing here?
I think, Steve, you started off the session by outlining that they're concerned about these things only after having started some of the migrations. The wonderful opportunity that the cloud transformation or migration Office 365 presents is the ability to kind of go and take a second look at the way that you're managing infrastructure, really adapt to the newer model that cloud provides, where you're moving from people managing servers in their own infrastructure to managing services. And Bob said it in his presentation, that kind of drives you to really having to do some definition of taking the services that Office 365 provides and narrowing it down to, okay, what does that mean for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or the state of California or a specific agency or county? Because not every government organization is going to enable services in the same way. And so having a cloud migration project really allows you to, and sort of forces you to, take a second look at the way in which you're managing your infrastructure, the way in which you're enabling people to use information. And as a result, these steps that Planet can take you through help you to realize the changes that are coming, and also realize the impacts that it has on users. So this effort, and the fact that Planet is kind of leading the way in managing this cloud transformation for its customers, helps us to drive those decision making, those decisions to be made, those organizational structure changes to happen. I think our government customers understand that it needs to change, but I don't necessarily have a roadmap, and this provides them that roadmap.
Yeah, I'd love to get everybody's thoughts on this, because one of the really interesting conversations that I have a lot with the various different customers that I'm dealing with at all different levels of their organization is there appears to be some sort of dynamic where customers generally feel like Microsoft should be providing them this out-of-the-box guidance without them really understanding that they sort of are now their own commercial service provider for their agencies, departments, and constituents. I'd love to hear anybody's comments on that, because again, I think Microsoft's perspective, and Tony, is that Microsoft's providing this great framework for you to adopt these technologies, but how you choose to adopt them and how you choose to transform with them is really up to the customers. I'd like to hear anybody's thoughts on that kind of thinking.
Well, I mean, I can start off with, sort of, they are providing the guidance, right? But the difference is that it's not sort of personalized to the objectives of that particular agency, right? So when Microsoft provides this guidance, it has to be, here's everything you can possibly do under every scenario that any customer may possibly want, right? And that is, it's fairly well documented, but looking through and saying, hey, you can shrink the size of OneDrive from 1 terabyte to 250 gigs or whatever number because that makes sense for your organization for whatever reason. The documentation doesn't say that. It just says you have up to and you can change it. Somewhere for your best interest, right, you need to plug in, and this is a really simple one, but you need to plug in the answer and then tell your users that's the answer, right? And I think that, I'm an analogy guy, Microsoft is providing you a chemistry set, right? It's not providing you the finished experiment, right? And so, you need to be able to determine what you're going to do with those, pieces of the puzzle that you have in your chemistry set to make what you need at the end of the day, right? And I think that's the part they can't possibly predict that, really, right? And so it has to be customized for you.
And the important thing there, though, is that chemistry set, the set of services in Office 365, is ever changing. So what's important about establishing governance and planning up front is you're building the infrastructure to support the fact that the service is ever changing. And so if we don't get that infrastructure, that how is it custom, how does it fit in your organization set right, you're going to be behind the 8 ball, because as Microsoft does, new features, new services come out. And at that point, as we've said, I think a couple times, your end users want to know, is it okay for me to start using that? Or am I not allowed to? And having clear instructions, a service description that articulates this stuff. Building that process from the outset allows you to, as new features come out, incorporate in that enterprise services framework, incorporate them in as they come in, and you're much more proactive as opposed to reactive to the changes that Microsoft's making.
Absolutely. So Travis, how are you guys seeing people deal with change? How are you seeing them, and is your organization helping customers manage through that change in the concept of governance and security and those types of things?
So from a Planet perspective, obviously the engineers, we're up to speed on all the latest and greatest, but integrating that into organizations, it really, this is where, my team does really well, because we have a ton of operational experience, so we can go in and we can perform that discovery with the customer and determine what their organizational processes are, and then retrofit any new feature or process that is out with those services into their existing processes. Say as simple as the onboarding process. How do you license a user? How do you deprovision a user when they leave the organization? Those types of things. So for the most part, it's pretty streamlined as long as you understand how it works and then how it fits into their existing process.
And so that's great, and that's fabulous on the operational side, right? But Bob, on the sort of service side, one of the great stories you tell all the time, maybe you want to share it with us today, is the whole, we were working with a southeast state and how they managed through. We have groups.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a state in the southeast. Groups got turned on. And it's a pretty innocuous name, right? So I don't think anybody really sort of felt what the potential impact was. And then they woke up one day and realized just a couple of weeks later they had thousands of them, right? With no real no real understanding of what the impact was, right? They went back quickly and say, this is something. They tried to find documentation. It was okay, but it didn't tell all the stories, and so they started dialing for every person they can get their hands on to try to explain, okay, where is this being stored? Is this coming out of my storage quota? What's the impact, or what are the settings by default? It's actually a hidden area within SharePoint site collection, right? So they couldn't even find it, right? And so, it can have an enormous impact, and that sort of goes, to what Travis was saying earlier, right, is that we can establish all of these policies, but I think the big part about, sort of understanding change is dividing up the service areas into bite-sized chunks and having owners, right? That's a big part of this framework, right? And like I said initially, right, Planet comes in and we sort of walk through everything, but we're going to walk away, right? And so understanding as an organization who owns OneDrive, and if there are new changes. OneDrive is a perfect example when we're talking about provisioning, deprovisioning. It's a completely different product than it was just 6 months ago about what you could do, because the admin capabilities have changed so much, right? So somebody needs to know, hey, the changes are coming for my product that I own. How might that impact? Let's have a meeting. Let's bring it to the governance board that says when it comes live on the tenant, this is our guidance. Not in the case of our customer that we'll leave the name out, right? That after it was deployed and found out there's thousands of them, right? And I think that's really important piece of the strategy looking long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, there's a feature within Office 365 called First Release. they can build it into their governance process so that the IT administrators, kind of maybe some select business users, have access to those new features before they roll them out generally to the population.
I want to talk a little bit about the red lever. I love the red lever analogy. I want to talk a little bit about that. One of the things that I find fascinating as we talk to customers is, and OneDrive is the perfect example, but really external sources in general is the perfect example, right? The answer is always no, and so since it's no for one thing, it's no for everything, and I pull the giant red lever and I shut everything out. And meanwhile, there are really transformational and critical business processes that I could be buying into or really taking advantage of, and I'm not. So, how are you guys individually from your different roles taking customers through this and saying, no, let's not pull the big red lever. Let's look at what your real business requirements and what your security concerns are. How are you guys taking customers through that process?
Well, at the state level, and this is, I think, dependent upon what type of tenant model they approach it with, but let's just say that a state embraces a single tenant model. You're going to have multiple tiers, as we've talked about, or multiple levels where the central IT organization will probably be the first to say, here's what's allowed, basically protecting the parameter, and I try to understand what level of governance, policy implementation, security is impacted at that level. And then each discrete customer entity, whether it's an agency or secretariat, a group of agencies, has to make sure that they're taking into consideration those very unique requirements that they have. Your CGIS organizations, the public safety organizations, have very discrete, distinct, different requirements, as does HHS with HIPAA. And so as that governance model evolves, you've got multiple tiers where you need to incorporate governance and you need to understand what's going to be enabled at the enterprise IT level versus what is going to be required or overlaid by each agency depending upon their specific compliance requirements.
Well, and I'll add just real quick, I came up with the big red lever analogy because literally, although it's not red, there are blue levers in the admin console that universally turn off features, right? And it's not that, hey, you should not turn off external sharing for the bulk of circumstances, but you should actually individually, assess any major security component that can be universally turned off. Is there also a way to individually enable it against that, or do I need to leave it on and turn it off across everything further down in the settings? OneDrive, for example, I can turn it off at each individual OneDrive or on each individual OneDrive, or I can turn it off across the board. Because you won't be able to do what Dave said, right? And that's the whole point of that. I'm not suggesting that that everybody should allow external sharing across the board for everyone. That's crazy, right? But what I'm trying to say with the whole big red lever thing is that you shouldn't just turn it off in your tenant, and not only that, turn it off in every element of SharePoint in every place that there is, because there are probably really good examples where it should be allowed and is beneficial to the organization. So instead of doing the knee-jerk turn it all off, say, I'm going to leave it on at the tenant level, but then go into these individual settings and lock it down for the agencies that have those requirements.
And so when you guys start talking about this, and it's really interesting on this panel because we do have a really interesting cross-section of viewpoints and roles, is in every one of these conversations and almost every one of these answers, there's been sort of hey, there are business decisions that have to be made, but then there's technical implementation and technical design decisions that help enforce or reinforce those business decisions, right? So I think that's fascinating, right? But I think one of the things we want to tell our customers is it's not hard, right? Tony, it's not hard.
No, it's not hard at all. And what I tell most of my customers that are new to Office 365 is to start with a service at first. And usually it's email, and then get that under your belt, and then move on to the next one, and and increase your maturity, and then move on to the next one. So typically it's Office 3. It's email, it's Office Pro Plus, then Skype or SharePoint, and just making sure that you kind of evolve because over time these services are also getting they're cutting across as we roll out into groups and teams.
And especially you start looking at things the way DLP rules play into this, and records retention and that type of stuff, e-discovery. So I think that leaves us really, I think, the most important question here today for me for the panel, which is, and I'll start with you, Bob. This all sounds great to our folks that are watching this today and joining us on the summit. How do they get started?
Well, that's a great question, right? So obviously we have put together sort of a package of services that outline all the pieces of this puzzle. And if you are brand new to Office 365 and just starting to deploy, that's great, right? You probably need, all of these pieces, or at least, you have a conversation about which pieces you want to take on. But for customers that have already gone, those customers that you heard at your summit, right? What we do is, just reach out to us and we'll walk through what you have and say, based on what our conversations, here are the pieces that are still missing in your puzzle, and sort of help talk you through, this is what you still need, and then get to that point of saying, okay, which pieces do you want to take on? Which pieces would you like us to help you with our experience?
And that's great, and we certainly hope that everybody does contact Planet for sure. But Tony, if for some reason somebody crazily does not choose to contact Planet, what would your suggestion be to start?
To start, so for every successful Office 365 project, they need a project sponsor, a project manager, and a good partner. And if they don't have a partner, we have Microsoft Fast Track that can help them with the migration to Office 365.
Fantastic. Well, we want to thank our panelists today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I think it was a fantastic session. This is one of those topics we need to be talking about every day so that we can help our customers get the most out of Office 365 in a safe, secure, and compliant way.